Hey everyone, welcome back. Have you ever felt like everything was perfect, only to discover that trust can be broken in an instant? What would you do if someone close to you betrayed you? How would you handle the pain and revenge? So, let me ask, have you ever had to face the truth about an affair you didn't see coming? Well, without wasting any time, let's jump into today's story. It's about to get intense. The house was quiet, peaceful, just as it had always been. I sat in the living room, watching my wife and daughter in the kitchen, preparing dinner. It was a typical evening. My wife, always the one who brought warmth to our home, hummed softly as she chopped vegetables, while our daughter sat at the kitchen table, sketching away in her notebook. A perfect picture of family life, or so it seemed. We had been married for 10 years. Our daughter, Emily, was now 12, growing into a smart, kind young girl. We had built a life together that many would envy: steady jobs, a comfortable home, and love that felt unshakable. My wife, Sarah, had always been the center of our world. Her laughter filled every room, and her smile made the days brighter. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a connection that ran deeper than words. I thought we were happy, truly happy. But recently, something started to feel different. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first. A slight change in Sarah's routine here, a small distance between us there. Little things, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me question whether everything was really as perfect as it appeared. I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just the stress of everyday life, maybe it was nothing. But there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, a sense that something wasn't quite right. It started with the late nights. Sarah had been working longer hours at her job lately, coming home later than usual. She was always tired, too tired to talk when she did come home. She would kiss me briefly, then head straight to bed, leaving me sitting alone in the living room. It wasn't like her. She was always the one to sit and talk, to share the details of her day. But now, the silence between us grew. I told myself I was overthinking it. Work had always been stressful for her, especially around this time of year. But there was more. She'd begun taking more phone calls in private, stepping outside or into the other room to talk. I'd catch glimpses of her face as she spoke. There was a certain guardedness in her expression, a coolness that hadn't been there before. I tried to dismiss it, tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. At first, I didn't want to believe it. I had always trusted Sarah. We had built a life together. We had our ups and downs, but I never thought for a moment that trust would be the issue. But something was off. I wasn't sure what it was yet, but the unease in the air was undeniable. It wasn't like the tension from a bad day at work or a minor disagreement. No, this was something deeper, something that seemed to settle in our home, like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. I watched Sarah that night as she finished her call and returned to the table, her eyes avoiding mine for just a second longer than usual. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I felt a wave of doubt wash over me, but I pushed it aside. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just imagining things. Still, that feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. Something was wrong. I couldn't yet pinpoint what it was, but I knew I was about to find out. The days passed, each one blending into the next, but the sense of unease in our home grew. I began to notice the changes more clearly, and they weren't just in Sarah's behavior. It was in the little things, the details that I had once overlooked but now seemed to carry a weight. She wasn't the same. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. But the more I observed, the harder it became to ignore. The first sign was the late nights. Sarah's work schedule had always been demanding, but now, she was staying late almost every night. The work was piling up, she'd say, the deadlines were tight. She'd explain it casually, but the more she said it, the more distant she seemed. In the past, she'd always make time for us, even if it was just for a quick dinner together before heading back to her office. But now, she was barely there. The moments we used to share felt like they were slipping through my fingers, and no matter how hard I tried to hold on, they were gone. I couldn't help but notice the phone calls she'd take in private. It wasn't like her. Sarah had never been secretive with her phone, always leaving it on the kitchen counter or in the living room, never worried about someone looking through it. But now, she'd step into the other room or even go outside to talk, her voice lowering, her words guarded. I tried not to think much of it at first. She'd say it was just work, just a colleague needing a quick chat or a client discussing a last-minute change. But something about the way she spoke, the way her tone changed when she was on the phone, made me uneasy. I began to wonder if I was just overreacting. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was just stressed from work, and I was reading too much into it. But then the absences started. It wasn't just late nights anymore. There were mornings when she'd leave early, saying she had an early meeting or a client to meet. She'd kiss me goodbye with a quick, distracted peck on the cheek, her mind already elsewhere. I would barely have time to wake up fully before she was gone again. Each time she left, the house felt emptier, quieter. I didn't confront her, though. Not yet. I wasn't sure I was ready to face what I was starting to suspect. The thought of it, the very possibility, seemed too painful to consider. So, I let it go. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, just the result of a stressful period in her life. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The changes were too noticeable to ignore, too frequent to be just coincidence. It wasn't just Sarah's behavior that had shifted. Emily, our daughter, had begun acting differently too. She had always been a happy, talkative child, eager to share her day and ask about mine. But over the past few weeks, something had changed. She became quieter, more withdrawn. I noticed her glancing at Sarah and me in ways she hadn't before, her eyes filled with an unspoken question. She seemed to be walking on eggshells around us, especially Sarah. There were moments when I caught her staring at her mother, her brow furrowed, as if she knew something was wrong but didn't know how to say it. I tried to talk to her about it, but she'd always brush me off, saying everything was fine. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily knew more than she was letting on. There was a quiet tension in her demeanor that mirrored what I was feeling. Something wasn't right, but none of us were talking about it. Emily stayed silent, perhaps not wanting to bring up something that could hurt us even more. I knew that deep down, she must have noticed the changes in Sarah too, but like me, she was probably hoping it was all a misunderstanding. The silence in the house was deafening. Sarah's quiet phone calls, Emily's strange behavior, and the growing distance between us all created a heavy atmosphere. I could feel it building, the tension that hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I tried to ignore it, but it was becoming impossible. I didn't know what was happening, but the signs were clear. Something was wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was just waiting to be uncovered. It was a Saturday afternoon when everything changed. The house was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that you feel in your bones, like the calm before a storm. Sarah had gone out for groceries, and I was in the study, sorting through some paperwork for work. Emily was in her room, as usual, lost in her books. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake that unsettling feeling I'd been carrying around for weeks. I had no idea what was about to unfold. I heard the front door open and close, followed by footsteps. At first, I thought it was Sarah returning early, but something about the footsteps felt different, more hurried, more frantic. I stood up, about to call out to Sarah, when I heard the sound of a door creaking open. It was the door to the guest room, the room we rarely used but kept tidy just in case we had visitors. Then, I heard a voice. A man's voice. I froze. It wasn't a voice I recognized, and in that moment, everything in me screamed that something was terribly wrong. I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to confront it, but my feet moved of their own accord. I stepped quietly toward the door of the guest room, the sound of the man's voice growing clearer. My heart raced in my chest as I reached the door, my hand hovering over the knob. Before I could even register what I was doing, I pushed the door open just a crack. The sight that greeted me made my stomach churn. There, on the bed, was my wife, Sarah. But she wasn't alone. A man was with her, their faces pressed close together as they whispered and laughed, oblivious to the world around them. It was like something out of a nightmare, too surreal to be real, but there it was. The man was older than Sarah, but they shared an intimacy that made my blood run cold. I didn't recognize him, but in that moment, I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was happening. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to shout, to confront them right there, but my body refused to move. I stood frozen, watching them, unable to tear my eyes away from the betrayal unfolding before me. It was as if time itself had stopped, each second stretching into eternity. I felt like I was suffocating, the air thick with shock and disbelief. The door creaked again, and I snapped back to reality. I quickly stepped back, trying to hide behind the wall, but not before I caught a glimpse of Emily's face as she walked past the door. Her eyes locked with mine for a brief second, her expression unreadable, before she turned and walked away. I didn't know what to think. My mind raced, trying to process what I had just seen. Was it really happening? Was this some kind of twisted joke? I couldn't bring myself to believe it, but deep down, I knew I had seen the truth. I didn't know how long I stood there, my body trembling. The reality of it was too much to comprehend, and yet, I had seen it with my own eyes. I wanted to confront Sarah immediately, to demand an explanation, but something inside me told me to wait. I didn't know why. Maybe it was the shock, maybe it was the fact that I didn't want to believe what I had seen, but I couldn't bring myself to walk into that room. Instead, I went back to the study, trying to regain my composure. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind spinning. I kept replaying the image of Sarah with that man in my head, unable to erase it. The pain was unbearable, but there was more. I had seen Emily's face as she passed by the door. It was like she knew, too. She had seen something. I wasn't the only one who knew the truth now. Emily had witnessed it, and I could see the conflict in her eyes as she turned away. She had to be struggling with the same weight of the betrayal. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call her, to ask her what she knew, but I didn't. She was my daughter. I didn't want to burden her with something so painful, so destructive. But I couldn't ignore the fact that Emily had seen it, too. I wondered how long she had known. Had she been hiding it from me, just like Sarah had been hiding the affair? The tension in the house was palpable after that day. I could feel it every time I looked at Emily. She wasn't the same. She was distant, quieter than usual, as though she was carrying a secret she wasn't ready to share. The air between us felt thick with unspoken words. I wanted to confront her, to ask her what she knew, but I held back. It wasn't just about Sarah anymore, it was about Emily, too. It wasn't until the next evening, after Sarah had gone out again, that Emily finally came to me. Her eyes were red, and there was a tremble in her voice as she spoke. "Dad, I need to tell you something," she said, her words barely a whisper. I could tell she had been holding onto this for far too long. Suspense hung in the air as she hesitated, unsure of how to begin. My heart pounded in my chest. Finally, she looked me in the eye and said the words I had been dreading. "I saw Mom, with him. I saw everything, Dad." The moment Emily spoke those words, everything inside me seemed to freeze. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. I had already seen enough to know the truth, but hearing it from my daughter, hearing it confirmed, made the reality feel even more suffocating. For a moment, I didn't know what to say, how to process what I was feeling. I was angry, heartbroken, betrayed, and yet, a part of me was still hoping I had misunderstood, hoping that maybe, just maybe, this was all some terrible mistake. But deep down, I knew. Emily had seen it, too. There was no denying it. I had to confront Sarah. I couldn't just let this linger in the air, this crushing uncertainty. I knew that the conversation ahead would shatter everything I thought I knew about our life, our family. But I had no choice. When Sarah came home later that evening, the tension in the house was unbearable. She walked in, her usual smile fading the moment she saw my expression. Emily had already retreated to her room, leaving me alone with Sarah. I could feel my hands shaking, my heart racing, but I steeled myself. I wasn't going to let her lie to me anymore. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady, though my insides were anything but. "We need to talk." She looked at me, a flicker of concern in her eyes. She put down her purse and sat on the couch, waiting for me to speak. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure, but the anger was building inside me. I knew I had to keep my cool, but the betrayal was eating at me. I couldn't look at her without seeing the image of her with that man. "Is there something you want to tell me?" I asked, my voice quieter now, but still laced with an edge. She didn't respond right away, just looked at me, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice too calm, too practiced. She was already putting on a mask, trying to hide whatever was happening beneath the surface. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked to the window, needing a moment to gather my thoughts. The silence between us was thick, and I could feel her eyes on my back, sensing the tension. After a moment, I turned to face her again, my mind made up. "I know, Sarah," I said, my voice low but firm. "I know about you and him. I know about the affair." For a moment, she was completely still. Her face didn't show any sign of surprise, but the slightest shift in her posture, the way her shoulders tensed, told me everything I needed to know. She didn't deny it at first. Instead, she opened her mouth, as if to speak, but no words came out. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of her guilt hanging heavy in the air. "I don't know what you're talking about," she finally said, her voice shaky, but she still tried to keep the facade up. "This is ridiculous, why would you even?" I cut her off, my voice rising despite my attempts to remain calm. "Don't lie to me, Sarah. I saw you. I saw you with him, in the guest room. You think I didn't notice? And now Emily, our daughter, has seen it too. You can't lie your way out of this." Her face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks. She opened her mouth again, but this time, no words came. The panic in her eyes was unmistakable. She tried to gather herself, but it was clear she was losing control. I didn't want you to find out like this," she said, her voice trembling now. "It's not what you think." My hands clenched into fists, the anger rising up in me like a tidal wave. "Not what I think? What am I supposed to think, Sarah? You've been sneaking around behind my back. You've been lying to me, to Emily. And for what? For him? Tell me it's not true." She swallowed hard, her face a mixture of guilt and fear. It's complicated, okay? It's not that simple. I never meant for it to go this far. I was feeling lonely. You don't understand, everything has changed. I thought maybe. Maybe what? I interrupted, my voice thick with disbelief. Maybe it was easier with him? Was that it, Sarah? Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think Emily wouldn't see what was happening? Did you think you could just keep lying to me forever? She shook her head, the guilt evident in the way her hands trembled in her lap. She didn't know what to say anymore, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us deafening. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. This wasn't the time. Not when everything we had built was falling apart in front of me. She stood up then, her body tense, her face pale. I never meant for it to hurt you like this. I never wanted you to find out this way. The words hung in the air, empty, meaningless. How could she say she didn't want to hurt me when she had already done the worst thing imaginable? I couldn't find it in me to respond. I just stood there, my anger and hurt filling the room, suffocating me. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice breaking as she finally let her guard down. I'm so sorry. I don't know how to fix this. I didn't know how to respond either. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. We were both standing there, two people who had once loved each other, now standing in the wreckage of what was left. Would she admit it all? Or would she continue to lie? The truth hung between us, suspended in the air, and I was left waiting, unsure of what would happen next. The silence between us was unbearable, the weight of what had been said hanging thick in the air. I stared at Sarah, my mind racing, trying to make sense of everything. I could feel the anger boiling up inside me, but there was also this deep, aching pain that I couldn't escape. The betrayal felt like a wound that would never heal, a wound I didn't even know how to address. For a long moment, Sarah stood there, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She couldn't look at me, couldn't meet my eyes, and that was all the confirmation I needed. She knew what she had done, and now, the truth was finally coming out. I didn't want it to happen this way, she said quietly, her voice trembling. I never wanted to hurt you, not like this. I couldn't stop myself. My voice rose, louder than I intended. Then why did you do it, Sarah? How could you do this to me? To us? We had a life, a family. What did I do to deserve this? She swallowed hard, clearly struggling to find the words, but there was no turning back now. The facade had crumbled, and she had to face the truth. It wasn't about you, she said softly, almost as if she were talking to herself. It was about me. About how I felt. I felt so alone, so neglected for so long. You were always so focused on your work, and I felt like I was invisible. I needed something more, something I wasn't getting at home. My chest tightened, the words sinking into me like a blade. I had known for a while that something was off between us, but to hear her admit that she had felt neglected, was a blow I hadn't prepared for. It was like she was justifying it, making it seem like my failure as a husband was the cause of her actions. But it didn't make it right. Nothing would ever make it right. I tried, Sarah. I tried to be there for you. I worked hard for this family. But I guess I wasn't enough, was I? My voice cracked, and I had to pause, the anger and hurt overwhelming me. How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to me? How long have you been with him? She didn't meet my eyes, her gaze dropping to the floor. A few months. Maybe longer, I don't know. It started as a mistake, but it became something I thought I needed. I didn't know how to get out of it. My heart sank. A few months. All this time, she had been lying to me, to Emily. I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of the betrayal. The anger that had been building in me finally exploded. How could you do this, Sarah? I shouted, my fists clenched at my sides. How could you lie to me like this? How could you betray everything we had? She stepped back, flinching at the harshness of my words, but I didn't care. I couldn't hold back anymore. I needed answers. I needed to know everything. Tell me everything, I demanded. Tell me who he is. Where did you meet him? How many times did you? I stopped myself, not wanting to hear more details, but I couldn't stop the words from coming out. I need to know everything, Sarah. Don't leave anything out. She hesitated, her face pale, but she nodded slowly. His name is David. I met him at work, at a conference. It was innocent at first, just talking, but I don't know. I felt something, a connection that I didn't have with you anymore. He was kind to me, he listened to me when you didn't. He made me feel seen, like I mattered. My blood boiled, hearing her describe him as if he were some kind of savior. It made me sick to my stomach. So that's it? You just ran off with him? You didn't even think about what this would do to Emily? To me? To our whole family? I didn't want it to go this far, she whispered, tears filling her eyes. I never wanted to hurt you, but I was so lost. I didn't know how to fix things. I didn't know how to tell you. I couldn't look at her anymore. Every word she spoke felt like another blow, another piece of my heart being torn away. I had trusted her, loved her, and she had thrown it all away for some fleeting connection with another man. The anger was consuming me, but beneath it was this deep, gnawing pain that made it impossible to breathe. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. My wife, the woman I had built my life with, had betrayed me in the worst possible way. And I had been blind to it all. I had been living a lie. As the conversation wore on, I could feel the air growing heavier. My mind was reeling, the pain and confusion overwhelming. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take any more, I remembered Emily. She had been the one to expose the truth, to force it into the open. She was the one who had dragged this nightmare into the light. The guilt hit me like a wave. I hadn't spoken to her about it. I hadn't even acknowledged her role in all this, how she had been carrying that secret all along, just like me. I had been so consumed by my own pain and anger that I hadn't even stopped to think about how Emily felt. I turned away from Sarah, my voice quiet but full of emotion. What about Emily? How is she handling this? How do you think she's going to feel when she knows everything? Sarah looked away, the guilt on her face evident. I don't know. I've tried to protect her from all of this, but I'm not sure how much longer I can keep it from her. She already knows so much. My heart broke all over again. My daughter had been carrying this burden, this horrible secret, and I had been too blind to see it. She must have felt so alone in this, so torn between us. I could only imagine the guilt she was feeling now, unsure of how I would react to her involvement in all of this. I had no idea what the future held for our family. But one thing was certain, everything had changed. Nothing would ever be the same again. The house was silent. The air felt thick with tension, as if it had become a living, breathing entity, pressing in on all sides. I stood there, staring at the floor, the weight of Sarah's confession still heavy on my shoulders. I couldn't process everything all at once. The betrayal, the hurt, the anger, it was all swirling inside me like a storm I couldn't control. But one thing was clear, she had to pay for what she had done. I had spent years of my life building a family, a home, a life with her, and she had torn it all apart. I couldn't just let this go. I couldn't just forgive her, no matter how much I wanted to. What she had done was unforgivable. And if I was going to make her feel the weight of her actions, I had to make sure the punishment was just as deep. For the first time since I had found out, I started thinking clearly, too clearly. I started thinking about revenge. I had to make her understand the gravity of her betrayal, the way she had destroyed everything we had worked for. She had to feel the pain I was feeling. And for that, I needed a plan. I couldn't just confront her again and shout my anger into the void. That wouldn't be enough. I had to strike where it hurt the most, where she would feel it for the rest of her life. As I sat down in the dimly lit living room, I let my mind wander over the possibilities. What could I do to make her suffer like she had made me suffer? Part of me wanted to expose her affair to everyone, our family, our friends, the people she worked with. She deserved to have her reputation destroyed, to feel the sting of public humiliation. I could already picture the look on her face when she realized how far I had gone to make her feel every ounce of the pain she had caused. But then I stopped myself. No, that wouldn't be enough. Public humiliation wouldn't truly make her understand what she had done. It would only create more drama, more heartache. It wasn't the satisfaction I was seeking. What I needed was something more personal, more profound. I needed to hit her where it hurt most, her heart, her sense of security, her sense of self. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I didn't want to just expose her affair. I didn't want to make her regret it in a way that would only make her angry. No, I wanted her to feel the consequences of her actions in a way that would follow her for the rest of her life. I wanted her to lose what mattered most, the trust of the one person who had always stood by her. But as I began to plot, I could feel the tension building between us. She could sense that something was wrong, that I wasn't as calm as I appeared to be. The moments we spent in the same room became more charged with tension. Every word she said felt like a justification, an attempt to make things right, but the more she tried, the more I felt myself pulling away. I never meant to hurt you, she had said over and over again. I was just looking for something more. But I didn't want her excuses anymore. I didn't want her empty apologies. They meant nothing to me. I could feel my anger growing, simmering beneath the surface. She could feel it too. Whenever we spoke, her defenses went up. She tried to explain, to make herself look like the victim in this situation. I wasn't happy, she kept saying. You weren't paying attention to me. I didn't know where to turn. I wasn't buying it. Not anymore. The guilt that had once made me question everything was now replaced by something much stronger. I had made my decision. And my decision was simple: I would make her understand what she had lost. But how? How could I make her truly regret her actions in a way that would teach her a lesson she would never forget? I thought back to the years we had spent together, the moments that had once felt so perfect. I thought about Emily, about how she was caught in the middle of this nightmare. The pain I felt for her made me more determined. If Sarah had betrayed me, she had also betrayed our daughter. That's when the idea hit me. I didn't want just to punish her. I wanted to take everything she had worked for, the life we had built, and turn it upside down. I wanted her to feel completely alone, to experience the isolation I had felt when I realized what she had done. I wanted her to know what it felt like to lose everything in an instant. But how to go about it? I couldn't just end our marriage. It wasn't enough. Divorce, separation, it was too clean, too easy. What Sarah needed was a real wake-up call, something that would make her realize what she had lost, not just me, but the family she had destroyed. I had to make her feel the consequences of her actions deeply and personally. If I could expose her for what she really was, destroy her relationship with Emily, and sever the emotional ties that had once held us together, she would understand. She would feel the consequences of her choices, not in a public spectacle, but in the intimate, painful consequences of losing everything she once took for granted. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became. I had to be patient. This plan wasn't something I could rush. It had to be calculated, precise. It had to come at the right time, in the right way, when she least expected it. And when it did come, it would be too late for her to fix. I wasn't going to give her a chance to redeem herself, not after what she had done. She would feel the weight of her betrayal, and she would feel it for the rest of her life. As I looked at the reflection in the window, my face hardening with resolve, I knew one thing for sure: the revenge was coming. and it would be more than she could ever have imagined. I had spent days planning, weeks thinking about the best way to make Sarah feel the full weight of her betrayal. Every step I took brought me closer to the moment I had been building towards. I had made my decision. I wasn't going to let her off easy. It was time for revenge, and I would make sure she felt every ounce of pain that I had been carrying since the moment I discovered the affair. The first step was simple, but it would have the most profound impact. I had to expose her. Not just in the privacy of our home, but to the world, her friends, her family, her colleagues. I had to make sure that everyone who mattered to her knew what she had done. It would be impossible for her to hide, to salvage any part of her reputation. I had already laid the groundwork, and now it was time to set everything in motion. It started with a text message. I knew Sarah would be meeting her lover, David, that evening. She had no idea that I knew their usual meeting spot, a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town where they had been meeting for the past few months. I'd done my research, checking her phone records and subtly tracking her movements. Everything she had done to hide her affair was now being used against her. I sent a simple message to her closest friend, Julie, someone who had always been a part of our lives. I had been careful not to raise any suspicions when I'd spoken to Julie in the past, playing the role of the concerned husband without revealing too much. I wrote, Julie, I think it's time you knew the truth about Sarah and David. I'll be at the cafe tonight. You should come by and see for yourself. The message sent, I sat back in my chair, feeling a sick satisfaction in knowing that Sarah was about to lose control of the situation. Her best friend would be there to witness the affair firsthand. Julie, who had known Sarah for years, would be the one to see the truth unfold before her eyes. The next few hours dragged on. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the adrenaline building up as I waited. I kept telling myself that this was the only way to make her understand, to make her realize the gravity of what she had done. I wasn't just punishing her for me, but for Emily as well. This was about making her own mistakes known to the people she cared about most. Finally, the moment arrived. I received a text from Julie, I'm here. I see them. What do you want me to do? I took a deep breath and composed myself. Take pictures. Make sure you get everything, every detail. I want her to feel exposed. When you can, leave and let her know you're disappointed. I'll handle the rest. Julie's response was swift, done. Within minutes, I knew that Sarah was in the process of being exposed. I had just launched the first phase of my revenge. As soon as she received the photos, the phone calls would begin. Julie would tell the rest of their friends, and soon the whispers would start. No one would be able to ignore the truth anymore. Sarah, though, had no idea what was coming. I waited in the silence of our house, watching the clock tick on. As the evening wore on, the first signs of panic began to creep into the atmosphere. I could hear Sarah talking on the phone in the other room, her voice a little higher than usual, filled with anxiety. The conversation was frantic, and though I couldn't hear everything she was saying, I knew something was wrong. She finally entered the living room, her face pale. "What did you do, Jake?" she asked, her voice shaking. There was a tremor of fear in her words, and it sent a wave of satisfaction through me. "What do you mean, Sarah?" I said, feigning ignorance. "What's wrong?" "Julie, she saw me. She saw me with David. She saw everything." Her eyes were wide with panic now, and I could see the realization dawning on her. She was beginning to put the pieces together, to understand that this wasn't just some random mistake. This was deliberate. I didn't answer her immediately. Instead, I let her stew in the fear. I could see the panic starting to overtake her, and a part of me reveled in it. She had put me through hell. Now, it was time for her to experience the fallout of her actions. I could feel my control over the situation tightening. "I can't believe you did this," Sarah whispered, her hand trembling as she held onto the edge of the table for support. "How could you do this to me?" I finally looked at her, my expression cold. "You did this, Sarah. You did it to yourself. You wanted the affair. You wanted the lies. Now you get to live with the consequences." "I can fix this," she begged, her voice desperate. "Please, Jake, let me explain. This isn't what you think. I didn't mean for this to happen." But I wasn't interested in her excuses anymore. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. I could see her heart racing, her mind working overtime to try and salvage what little dignity she had left. But it was too late for that. Her world was crumbling, and she knew there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Save it, Sarah. The truth is out. People are going to know. Your reputation is ruined." I could hear my own voice cracking, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You had your chance to make things right. Now you'll have to deal with the fallout." Her face twisted in horror. She had no idea what was coming next, how deep this would go. She had always thought she could control everything, her lies, her affair, her double life, but now it was all falling apart. I had made sure of that. The next day, the phone calls came pouring in. Friends, family, people from work, all of them had heard. Julie had done her part, and the whispers were everywhere. Sarah could no longer hide from what she had done. She had been exposed for what she truly was, a liar, a cheat. Her world had been turned upside down, and there was no going back. I watched as she broke down, unable to hold herself together any longer. Her reputation, her perfect life, all of it was gone. And in that moment, I knew I had done what I set out to do. I had made her feel the weight of her betrayal, the way she had made me feel. But even as I watched her crumble, I felt nothing but emptiness. I had gotten my revenge, but it didn't make the pain go away. It didn't make the hurt any less real. The damage was done, and no amount of revenge could undo what she had done to us. And so, we both stood in the ruins of what was left of our marriage, knowing that neither of us could ever go back to what we had before. The days after the exposure felt like an endless cycle of emotional torment. Sarah's world had unraveled so quickly, and there was no stopping the fallout. The calls, the messages, the judgment, it was all too much. Her friends, the ones she thought she could count on, began to distance themselves. Social media posts, once filled with images of happy family moments, were now filled with nothing but whispers and rumors. Everyone knew, and everyone had an opinion. It didn't take long before Sarah lost everything she had worked so hard to maintain. Her colleagues, once friendly and respectful, now avoided her. The invitations to events stopped coming. The constant tension in the air was suffocating. Everywhere she went, she could feel the eyes on her, the quiet judgment in every room she entered. No matter how hard she tried to salvage what was left of her dignity, it was all slipping through her fingers. I watched all of this unfold with a strange sense of satisfaction, though it was not as fulfilling as I thought it would be. There was no joy in seeing her suffer, no victory in watching her pay for her betrayal. It was all too much, too painful. I had wanted to make her understand the weight of her actions, but in the end, I realized that the cost was too high. I had taken the revenge I thought I deserved, but what did it really achieve? Her humiliation was a bitter pill, one that was impossible to swallow. And while I had finally exacted some form of justice, I couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that something was missing. I had shattered her life, but in doing so, I had also shattered something inside of me. The pain of betrayal still lingered in my chest, a wound that would never fully heal. No amount of revenge could erase the trust she had stolen from me, or the way she had torn apart everything we had built together. The house felt cold, silent. I couldn't even look at her anymore without seeing the image of the woman who had betrayed me. She was a stranger now, someone I no longer recognized. The woman who had promised to love me, to build a life with me, had become someone else entirely. And yet, despite everything, there was a part of me that still felt guilty. I wasn't proud of what I had done. The revenge, in all its cold satisfaction, felt hollow. I had wanted to make her feel the pain I had been carrying, to make her regret the affair, but I had also hurt myself in the process. The trust that had once been the foundation of our marriage was gone, and there was no way to rebuild it. It wasn't just Sarah who was suffering. I was too. The weight of the decision to expose her, to destroy everything, pressed on me like a heavy burden. I knew I had made the right choice, but that didn't mean it didn't come with its own consequences. My own emotions were in turmoil, anger, sadness, regret. It was all so overwhelming, and the idea of moving forward seemed impossible. The worst part was seeing Sarah's pleading face. She begged me to forgive her, to somehow fix what had been broken, but the words didn't reach me. I had made my decision. I wasn't going to let her off the hook. Not after everything. "I'm sorry," she would say, her voice broken with tears. "Please, Jake, please don't let this be the end. I know I've ruined everything, but I love you. I'm begging you to forgive me." But the words didn't mean anything anymore. She had said them too many times before, and each time, they had been empty promises, lies. I had once believed in her, trusted her with everything I had, and she had shattered that trust beyond repair. "Forgiveness isn't something I can give you anymore," I told her coldly, though I could feel the heaviness of the words in my chest. "What you did, Sarah. I can't just forget it. I can't just move on from it like it never happened. You've destroyed everything, and I don't know how to fix that." She fell to her knees in front of me, crying out, her face twisted in anguish. "Please, Jake, I never meant for it to end like this. I didn't want to lose you. I was lost, and I didn't know what to do. I'm so sorry." But I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. I couldn't bring myself to hold her and tell her everything would be okay, because I knew it wouldn't. There was no going back from this. The damage was done, and no amount of tears or apologies could undo the harm she had caused. The truth was, I didn't even know who she was anymore. The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted with my heart, was gone. What remained was someone who had chosen to betray me for her own selfish reasons. And no matter how many times she begged for forgiveness, I couldn't bring myself to trust her again. I couldn't bring myself to go back to a life with her. I spent the following days in silence, the house feeling colder and emptier with each passing moment. Sarah tried to talk to me, tried to explain herself, but I couldn't listen anymore. There was nothing left to say. The man I had been was gone, replaced by someone who had been broken beyond repair. The pain didn't go away, but it did start to fade. In its place, a numbness set in, a numbness that allowed me to move through the motions of daily life without feeling the sharp sting of betrayal. The revenge had been satisfying, but it hadn't healed anything. It hadn't given me closure. All it had done was expose the truth, and with it, the undeniable fact that our marriage, our family, was gone. And as Sarah's world continued to crumble, I couldn't help but wonder if I had lost more than she had. Because even as I stood firm in my decision to make her face the consequences, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was the one who had truly lost everything. Emily sat quietly in her room, her face buried in her hands, the weight of everything pressing down on her. The house had been filled with tension for days now. The once warm and lively atmosphere was now replaced by silence, and the only sounds that filled the air were the muffled sobs from her mother's room and the occasional heated argument between her parents. She had never expected things to unfold like this. When she had first walked in on her mother with David, her heart had raced with fear, knowing that her discovery would change everything. But she never imagined it would be this bad. The guilt gnawed at her, consuming her thoughts every moment of the day. Had she done the right thing? Had she betrayed her mother by telling her father the truth? She didn't know. All she knew was that her world was falling apart, and she had played a role in it. Her father had been reassuring, of course. He had told her that she had done the right thing, that the truth needed to be known. But those words didn't take away the heavy feeling in her chest. Every time she looked at him, she saw the broken man he had become. He wasn't the same loving, gentle father she had always known. The betrayal had transformed him. And yet, every time she saw her mother, her heart twisted with regret. She had torn their family apart, and no matter how hard she tried to justify it, the guilt remained. "Dad, I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Emily whispered one evening as she sat next to him on the couch. Her voice trembled, and she struggled to find the right words. I just didn't know what to do." Jake looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. He had been trying to stay strong for her, to reassure her that everything would be okay, but the truth was, nothing was okay. The trust in their family had been shattered beyond repair. "I know, Emily," he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I know you didn't mean for this to happen. You did the right thing by telling me the truth. Sometimes, we have to face things that are hard, things that hurt, even if we don't want to. But that doesn't make it any easier." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she looked at her father. She could see the hurt in his eyes, the pain he was carrying, and it made her heart ache. "Dad, I feel like I've ruined everything. I didn't want you to. I didn't want this to happen." Jake pulled her into a hug, his arms strong and protective, but there was a sadness in his embrace. "You didn't ruin anything, sweetie. You didn't cause this. Your mother did this. You were just trying to protect us, to protect me. I know it's hard, but this isn't your fault." But despite his words, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. Their family would never be the same again. The home they had once shared, filled with love and laughter, now felt like a prison. Her mother, once the center of their world, was now someone she could hardly recognize. And her father, though trying to stay strong, had been deeply hurt in a way that seemed irreparable. Emily knew that her father had made his choice. He had made it clear that there was no going back, that Sarah's betrayal had cut too deep for him to ever forgive her. And that left her in a place of deep confusion. What would happen to them now? Would they ever be able to heal from this? She found herself torn between the two people she loved most. On one hand, she saw the broken man who had been betrayed, the man who had given everything to their family and was now left picking up the pieces of his shattered life. On the other hand, she saw the woman who had raised her, the woman who had always been there for her, now distant and consumed by guilt. Emily didn't know how to fix it. She didn't know how to make everything right again. All she could do was try to hold on to some small shred of hope that things would one day get better. "I don't know if I can ever forgive her, Emily," Jake said quietly, his voice breaking slightly as he pulled away from her. "What she did. I don't know if I can ever move past it." His words hung in the air, heavy and final. Emily didn't know how to respond. What could she say? She had seen her father's pain firsthand, and she knew it was something he couldn't easily shake. She knew that her mother's actions had caused irreparable damage to their family, and there was no magic solution to undo what had been done. "Do you think we'll ever be okay?" Emily asked quietly, her voice filled with doubt. Jake looked at her, his eyes softening for a moment. "I don't know. I really don't. But we'll get through this. We'll figure it out together." But even as he said the words, Emily couldn't help but wonder if they would ever truly be okay again. Would their family ever return to the way it had been? Could trust be rebuilt after it had been broken in such a fundamental way? She wanted to believe it, but the truth was, everything felt different now. Everything had changed. The silence that followed was deafening. No one knew what the future would hold. All they could do was take things one day at a time, hoping that somehow, they would find a way to heal. But deep down, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the damage had been done. The family they once were was gone, and all they had now were the remnants of what had once been. And as the days passed, Emily couldn't help but wonder if the rift between her parents would ever truly heal, or if their family would forever be defined by the painful betrayal that had torn them apart. The days that followed felt like a blur. The once bustling household now felt eerily quiet, the walls closing in on all of us as we tried to navigate the aftermath of everything that had happened. There was no easy way to describe the emotional weight that hung over our home, suffocating every conversation, every moment of interaction. What had been a family built on love and trust had crumbled under the weight of betrayal, and I wasn't sure if there was any way to put the pieces back together. Sarah and I barely spoke anymore. She spent most of her time locked away in her room, and I retreated to the quiet solitude of the living room, only breaking the silence when Emily would quietly ask if I needed anything. The guilt in her eyes when she looked at me was almost too much to bear. She hadn't asked for any of this, but here she was, caught in the middle of a war between two people she loved, both of whom were broken in ways she couldn't understand. I knew she blamed herself, but it wasn't her fault. She had done what she thought was right. She had uncovered the truth, and in doing so, had set everything in motion. But the question lingered, had anything really been set right? Was this justice, or was it simply destruction? I couldn't deny that a part of me felt that justice had been served. Sarah's infidelity had torn apart the life I thought we had. The life we had built as a family. And while the consequences of exposing her affair had been swift and harsh, they had been inevitable. I had wanted her to feel the weight of her betrayal, and now she was suffering. But I wasn't sure if this was truly justice, or if it was just my attempt to balance the scales of a broken heart. In those quiet moments when I found myself alone with my thoughts, I began to reflect on everything that had happened. I had always believed in the sanctity of marriage, in the trust that was supposed to bind us together. I had thought that nothing could ever tear us apart. But now, looking back on it all, I realized how fragile that trust had been. Sarah's betrayal had shattered it in an instant, and once broken, there was no way to put the pieces back together. What had she taught me? That trust, once broken, could never be fully restored. That love, once tainted with deceit, was forever altered. I had learned that infidelity wasn't just about physical betrayal, it was about the emotional destruction it caused, the way it made you question everything you thought you knew about the person you loved. It was the slow unraveling of the bond that held everything together. I had been so focused on revenge, on making her understand the depth of her mistake, that I had failed to see the damage I was doing to myself. I had wanted her to feel the pain of betrayal, but in doing so, I had pushed myself further away from the person I used to be. I had allowed bitterness and anger to consume me, and in the process, I had lost sight of what truly mattered. As the days stretched on, I began to feel a sense of emotional closure, but it was nothing like I had imagined. There was no grand moment of victory. No triumphant return to the life we had known. There was only the slow realization that I had done what I thought was necessary, but at what cost? Emily's sadness weighed on me heavily. She had already lost so much, and I wasn't sure how much more she could take. I had failed her too. She had needed me to be a father, a steady presence in her life, but instead, I had become someone lost in anger and vengeance. I had let my need for justice overshadow the need for healing, for reconciliation. And then there was Sarah. We had gone from being partners, lovers, and parents to strangers. I had stripped away her dignity, exposed her in ways that couldn't be undone. I had sought revenge, but what had it really accomplished? Was it worth the broken family, the lost trust, the destruction of everything we had worked so hard to build? I didn't have the answers, and I wasn't sure if I ever would. The future felt uncertain. The question of whether our family would ever heal hung in the air like a dark cloud. Could we ever move past this? Would we ever be able to look at each other without the shadow of betrayal lingering between us? I couldn't say for sure. What I did know was that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. It might even be impossible. There was no going back to the way things had been. The damage had been done, and while the emotional wounds might eventually heal, the scars would remain forever. As I stood there, looking at the remains of what had once been my family, I felt a strange sense of emptiness. I had gotten what I wanted, but it hadn't brought the peace I had imagined. Justice had been served, but at a cost I wasn't sure I was willing to pay. The story didn't end with a happy resolution. The aftermath of betrayal wasn't neatly packaged in a way that offered closure. It was messy, painful, and filled with uncertainty. And as I looked at my daughter, who was still struggling to understand what had happened, I couldn't help but wonder if our family would ever come back together. Would there ever be a day when we could heal the wounds we had caused? Or was this the end of the road for us? The truth was, I didn't know. But in the silence that filled our home, I realized that no one could truly predict what the future would hold. All we could do was take things one day at a time and try to navigate the wreckage of what was left behind. And with that, I knew that our family's journey was far from over. It was just beginning, but whether we would be able to repair what had been broken, only time would tell. Months had passed since everything had fallen apart, yet the memories still lingered like ghosts in the corners of my mind. It felt like a lifetime ago that I had confronted Sarah, exposed her affair, and watched everything unravel before my eyes. The house, once filled with tension and silence, now felt a little more peaceful, though not without its scars. The emotional fallout of the past still hung over us, but time had a way of dulling the sharpest edges of pain. Sarah had been trying to rebuild her life, but it wasn't easy. The public humiliation, the broken relationships, the gossip, it all weighed on her. She had lost more than just my trust. She had lost her place in the social circles that had once been her refuge. I didn't feel any satisfaction from watching her suffer. In fact, it had only confirmed something deep inside me. Revenge, no matter how justified it felt in the moment, was a hollow victory. I had wanted her to understand the pain she had caused, but now that it was done, it felt meaningless. The damage had already been done. The trust we had built was irreparably broken. As for me, I had changed in ways I hadn't expected. At first, I had believed that exposing the truth and getting revenge would be the closure I needed. But as the days turned into weeks, and then months, I realized that closure wasn't a singular event. It wasn't a grand moment of justice, nor was it something I could force. True closure came from within, and it was something I had to work towards, piece by piece. It wasn't about letting go of the anger, but about accepting that I had no control over the past. I had become a different person in the process of all this. Stronger, yes. But also more aware of the fragility of trust and the cost of betrayal. I had learned that sometimes, the things we hold closest are the very things that can destroy us. I had learned that no matter how much we want to control the outcome, life has a way of throwing us curveballs when we least expect it. Emily had been my anchor through all of this. She had stayed quiet for so long, her heart torn between the two people she loved most. But as time passed, I could see the weight lifting off her shoulders. She was growing, healing in her own way, finding her own path in a world that had been turned upside down. I made sure to be there for her, to be the father she needed me to be. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing something right. I had learned the hard way that life was unpredictable, that the things we think are permanent can be ripped away in an instant. But in the midst of the chaos, I had also learned that it was possible to rebuild. The road ahead wasn't clear, but I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I had started to see a future that was separate from the past, one that wasn't defined by betrayal or revenge, but by growth and the potential for new beginnings. And just when I thought things were settling down, just when I thought I had reached a place of peace, the phone call came. It was Sarah. "Jake," her voice crackled over the line, and I could hear the tension in her tone. "We need to talk." 1,000 thoughts rushed through my mind in an instant. What now? Was this another attempt to mend what could never be fixed? Was she going to ask for forgiveness once again? Or was there something else, something unexpected, waiting for me? Part of me wanted to hang up and let her continue on with her life. I had done what I had to do, and I had moved on. But another part of me, the part that had been hurt so deeply, knew there was unfinished business. There was always unfinished business when it came to relationships like ours. I took a deep breath, the weight of the past years still pressing on my chest, but less heavy now. "What is it, Sarah?" She paused, and I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "I know things haven't been easy, and I know I've hurt you in ways I can never undo. But I need to tell you something. Something important. Please, just listen." I hesitated for a moment, but something in her voice made me stay on the line. "I'm listening." She took a long breath before continuing, her words slow and measured. "Jake, I've been thinking about everything. About the affair, about our marriage, about Emily. I've been going to therapy, and I'm starting to understand what led me to make the choices I did. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I don't even expect you to care about what I have to say. But I need to be honest. I'm not the same person I was when all this started." I felt a mix of emotions rising in me. Part of me wanted to cut her off, to tell her that her words meant nothing now. That I didn't need to hear any more excuses. But another part of me, something I hadn't expected, wanted to know the truth. The whole truth. "Go on," I said quietly. She exhaled slowly. "I'm not calling you to beg for your forgiveness. I just need you to know that I'm trying. And I'm sorry for everything. For what I did to you, to Emily, to our family." The silence between us felt heavy, and I knew this wasn't going to be the closure I had been searching for. But it was a step forward, something I hadn't expected. And maybe that was the twist in all of this, the truth that things could never truly be over. Maybe this was just the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Sarah, but for all of us. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to face it. Not with anger or resentment, but with a calm resolve. Whatever came next, I would handle it the way I always should have from the start, with strength, clarity, and a willingness to move forward. And as the phone call ended, I sat there for a long while, staring out the window at the horizon. The storm had passed, but I knew that life was far from predictable. Whatever came next, whether it was more pain or new beginnings, was something I was ready to face. This was my new beginning.